Corla. Taoiseach, I'm raising the case of a person who spent 5 years of his early life in Nazareth House in Sligo. And while his situation is unique to him, many, many others found themselves in the same circumstances. So my ask is a general one. Now, Nazareth House was an orphanage and care home, but this person was not an orphan. 3 days after giving birth to him, his mother was forced to emigrate by her family, by local clergy, indeed by the wider society, who didn't want what was then called a fallen woman in their midst. So a day-old motherless child was put into care, and this was back in the early 50s. Now, a few months ago, he became aware of the Mother and Baby Institutions payment scheme, and he asked me to submit a PQ asking if the Nazareth House could be included in the scheme. The response I received was very clear, where it states, Nazareth House was not an institution that provided ante- and postnatal facilities and therefore not included in the scheme. Needless to say, this man is very disappointed. He spent 5 years in Nazareth House, and while he emphasised he himself was not abused, indeed he was shown some kindness, he is well aware that many other boys suffered horrible abuse at that time. However, that's not the end of his story. One day, when he was 6 years old, a priest and a couple came to see him, and the next day he was told, pack your little bag, and he was put into the back of a small van and brought to live with total strangers. His last memories of Nazareth House is waving out the small windows at the back of the van at his friends, and they waving back at him as he travelled down the avenue. And his life from then on was hard slave labour on the farm he lived on and on neighbouring farms. And nobody ever came to see how he was doing. Now, Taoiseach, I've read the legislation on the mother and baby homes, and indeed the negative response I received is accurate. But now that the scheme is up and running, and it is recognised as a positive gesture by the state to those in its care who were grievously wronged, I'm asking if you consider looking at extending that scheme to include all those children who found themselves in institutions which were identical to mother and baby homes, with just one exception. Their mother did not give birth to them in that institution, and she didn't spend any time nursing them afterwards. And in many ways, this is even more cruel, if that is possible, for all those babies who were seen as a stain on our society, and their sense of loss, desolation and rejection never leaves them. It's just as great for them as for anybody in a mother and baby institution. So, Taoiseach, I know it's a big ask to extend this legislation to include institutions like Nazareth House, but I'm hoping that you will consider it.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
First of all, I thank the Deputy for raising this case and this issue, and indeed is a very harrowing life story that you've outlined, and I accept the presentation that you've made in respect of that life journey in terms of what happened in our past, in terms of the institutionalisation or how our society evolved, of children in particular, and then subsequent adoption and so forth, or placement of children in less than ideal situations. You're saying that the child was brought to a farm, almost slave labour essentially, and very, very shocking conditions. Now, of course, the Commission of Investigation that was set up in 2015 was tasked with examining the use of mother and baby institutions and county homes, their establishment, in my view, their shameful establishment of those, and even though I find it very difficult to comprehend the mores of the time, that in terms of the evolution of county homes into mother and baby homes and through the different decades and so forth. But the terms of reference were focused on those institutions, on the mother and baby home institutions, and sought to provide a place of antenatal and postnatal residence to both mother and baby. So that was the remit of the Commission. And all of that was associated with shame, with blame, judgment and very, very harsh treatment subsequently. And then it took 5 years for the Commission to complete its work, voluminous in itself. People maybe didn't anticipate, or the government of the day may not have anticipated it would take that long to complete its work. And essentially, it didn't cover other institutions where stigma, where trauma and abuse also occurred. And if you go back over the last 2 decades, or 3 decades for that matter, 4 decades, we've been investigating different institutions, be it industrial schools, be it Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes. There's been a very substantial evacuation, or excavation, if you like, of our past in terms of the institutionalization that was rife in terms of how society dealt with issues in the past. And it's been very traumatic for many, many people. And it's taken a long, long time. And it inevitably does. Again, you've identified one institution. There may be others in different categories. And it is very difficult in terms of encompassing various scenarios, because in other scenarios, orphanages, this is essentially an orphanage, but other orphanages would have had more benign impacts, or would have been of assistance to particular families as well. So it's, I mean, we can review and look at this, but not, I think in fairness, in the context of the mother and baby homes, that was what the Commission was asked to investigate, and the redress scheme was very much in response to the Commission's recommendations.
Look, both of us agree on the historical aspect. My question is about how the state in some way tries to compensate just a little bit for some of the awful experiences of those children in its care. Now, I've looked at the review clause in the legislation, and I'm not sure actually there's a possibility to extend it there. But there is a section, section 49, which says that the minister, in considering whether an institution shall be inserted, because the minister has that power, shall have regard to the circumstances experienced by persons resident in the institution, and whether these were comparable to those experienced by persons resident in institutions specified in the current legislation. So I think there is a tiny opening there for a minister to look at in the future. And while I understand this would be a significant expansion of the scheme, the fact that you now see it as a just and a good course of action, I am asking you just to look at that. I'm not asking you to make commitments on the floor of the House today, but just to confirm that you won't close the door on this.
Well, first of all, review mechanisms have been built into the legislation. Yeah. So doors are never finally closed. But I also would just offer this point as well. And I would have set up the Commission into the industrial schools. And I remember meeting with the survivors on day one, who never looked actually for a redress scheme. But what was clear to me was housing was important, future housing, healthcare, counselling, lifelong. To me, at times, that sometimes can be a more better response from the state. And having been through this for nearly 20-odd years now, 25, I've seen it in all of the various commissions and investigations. Lawyers get involved very quickly, and it moves very quickly to redress. And we do it, and the state owes redress, but actually, the more substantive response, in my view, is lifelong provision of counselling, lifelong provision of housing, lifelong provision of supports for people who've been through terrible ordeals in their lives because of institutionalisation or whatever. That is a view I've formed over a long time, dealing with many, many cases of this kind.